Somewhere right now, in a tiny studio apartment in Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires or Bogota, there is probably a developer drinking very strong coffee and fixing a bug. And here's the strange part. That tiny bug fix might be inside one of the most creative indie games you will play this year. Not the games with million-dollar marketing campaigns. Not the ones plastered across every storefront banner. I'm talking about the strange, colorful, widely creative games quietly coming out of the Latin American indie scene. Games built by tiny teams. These games mix folklore, surreal art, experimental mechanics, and pure subborn creativity. They are born from limited budgets, limited tools, and sometimes very unstable internet connections. But somehow, those limits push developers to try things that big studios rarely dare to attempt. Today, we are diving into some hidden gems from the Latin American indie scene that you absolutely need to play. And more importantly, we are going to look at why these games feel so different. Because once you see how these studios work, it might completely change how you think about game design. Also, fair warning. One of these games literally turns gravity into a puzzle mechanic, and it kind of breaks your brain once you've played it. If you follow indie games closely, you may have noticed something interesting over the last decade. A growing number of incredibly creative titles are coming from Latin America. The region's indie scene is also growing incredibly fast. Brazil alone now has hundreds of active studios, many of them tiny teams experimenting with new ideas. And with Latin America becoming one of the fastest growing gaming markets in the world, more developers are jumping in every year. Most of these studios are extremely small. We're talking teams of 2 to 10 people, sometimes working remotely across different cities. Budgets are limited. Access to large publishers is rare, and funding can be difficult compared to North America or Europe. So, instead of competing on scale, they compete on identity. They lean heavily into cultural themes, folklore, experimental art styles, and mechanics that stand out immediately. Many of these developers use accessible engines like Unity or Godot, tools that allow small teams to build polished experiences without massive infrastructure. Game jams also play a huge role in the region, especially events like Global Game Jam and regional indie festivals. A lot of prototypes that start as tiny jam experiments eventually grow into full releases. You can see this pattern across several standout games. But before we talk about the specific titles, there is one important idea to keep in mind. Constraint is often the secret fuel of creativity, and the Latin American indie scene is full of developers turning limitations into artistic advantages. Let me show you what I mean. Imagine trying to build a game studio where funding is scarce, hardware is expensive, and access to industry connections is limited. That is the reality many Latin American developers face. For example, the Brazilian studio behind the game Dandara, called Long Hat House, started as a tiny indie team experimenting with unusual movement systems. Instead of traditional platforming, Dandara lets you jump from surface to surface, across walls and ceilings. Gravity is not just a rule, it is a toy you can break. The mechanic sounds simple, but it completely changes how players think about space. You're not running left and right like a classic platformer. You are teleporting across surfaces in a strange, almost puzzle-like rhythm. And the mechanic did not appear because someone had a giant design department. It appeared because a small team experimented until something weird and interesting happened. Another great example is Mulaka, developed by Lienzo, a studio based in Mexico. Mulaka is a 3D action-adventure game based on a Raramuri indigenous culture. The game combines action-adventure mechanics with mythology, traditional stories, and landscapes inspired by real locations. Instead of generic fantasy worlds, the environments feel rooted in specific cultural traditions. This is something big studios often struggle with: authenticity. When a small team builds a game around their own cultural heritage, the result carries a different kind of emotional weight. And that authenticity becomes a design advantage. But the challenges are real. Funding can be inconsistent, marketing budgets are often tiny, and developers sometimes need to juggle freelance work just to keep the studio alive. Which is why many of these games stay hidden for years, until players start discovering them. Now, here is where things get really interesting. Some of the most creative indie mechanics in recent years have come from this region. Take the game Pato Box, created by Studio Bromium. At first glance, it looks like a bizarre cartoon boxing game. The protagonist is literally a humanoid duck with boxing gloves. Yes, a duck. But once you start playing, the game reveals a strange blend of punch-out style boxing mechanics and exploration sections inspired by classic adventure games. The visual style is entirely hand-drawn, heavily inspired by graphic novels and noir comics. The world is surreal, absurd, and a little unsettling, and that weirdness becomes part of the charm. Then there is Chris Tales, developed by the Colombian studio Dreams Incorporated. This game plays with time as a core mechanic. The screen is literally split into past, present, and future, allowing players to see how their actions affect the world in real time. For example, watering a tree in the present might cause it to grow instantly in the future section of the screen. From a technical design perspective, that means the developers had to build systems that simulate multiple timelines at once. Not exactly the easiest feature for a small team. Yet, they did it anyway. And visually, the game leans heavily into Latin American art influences. Bright colors, stained glass aesthetics, and architecture inspired by real Colombian cities. Now, before I tell you about another game that completely flips retro shooters on their head, there is something important to understand about how these teams work. Many of them prototype aggressively. They test strange mechanics quickly, often during game jams or small internal experiments. If something feels interesting, they build the entire game around it. This is something big studios rarely do because large teams require stable design decisions early in production. Small teams, on the other hand, can pivot quickly, and that flexibility leads to some really wild ideas. Now, let's talk about Blazing Chrome. This game was developed by the Brazilian studio Joy Masher. If you look at it for 5 seconds, it screams classic arcade shooter. Heavy inspiration from games like Contra, huge explosions, pixel art robots everywhere, but here's the twist. Blazing Chrome was built with extremely precise retro gaming design philosophy. The developers studied the pacing and mechanical structure of old arcade shooters almost like scientists. Enemy placement, weapon rhythm, level timing, everything was tuned to recreate that intense arcade flow. Instead of just copying nostalgia, they engineered it, and players noticed. The game quickly gained attention among retro fans who realized this tiny Brazilian studio had captured the spirit of classic run-and-gun games better than many modern attempts. Another fascinating example is Unsighted, developed by Studio Pixel Punk in Brazil. Unsighted introduces a brutal narrative mechanic. Every character in the game has a limited lifespan. Literally, they slowly lose a resource called anima, and when it runs out, they disappear from the story forever, including important characters, including merchants, including people you might have wanted to help later. This creates an emotional tension that most action RPGs never attempt. You are constantly deciding who deserves to survive. From a narrative design perspective, it is a brilliant example of mechanics reinforcing story themes. And again, this came from a small indie studio experimenting with ideas, not a giant corporate design committee. So, here is the big realization. These games are not impressive despite their limitations. They are impressive because of them. Limited budgets force teams to focus on one strong idea. Limited marketing means they must rely on word of mouth. Limited resources push developers toward distinctive art styles instead of expressive realism. In other words, constraint becomes a design tool. You can build a game around a strange mechanic, a cultural story, or a visual style that would never survive inside a massive studio pipeline. And that is exactly what we see in the Latin American indie scene. Developers embracing their cultural identity, experimenting with mechanics, and creating games that feel personal instead of corporate. And sometimes those experiments explode into global success. A famous example is Kerbal Space Program, originally created by the Mexican studio Squad. The game started as a strange physics sandbox about building rockets with tiny green astronauts. It eventually became one of the most beloved space simulations games ever made, praised even by aerospace engineers and space agencies for its surprisingly realistic orbital mechanics. Not bad for a quirky indie experiment. So, if you're looking for something new to play, I highly recommend diving into the Latin American indie scene. You might discover platformers that bend gravity, action RPGs that force you to choose who survives, or surreal boxing games starring very angry dogs. And behind each of those games is a small team solving huge creative problems with limited resources and a lot of stubborn passion. If you made it this far, you probably understand exactly why these hidden gems deserve more attention. Now I'm curious, have you played any indie games from Latin America that completely surprised you? Let me know what you think in the comments. And like always, thanks for watching.